if we have a form that is collecting a username, how can we take that input and display it into another page component? So let's have a look at the process of passing parameters in our routes. In many cases, you'll want to be navigating to a path that looks something like this here. So our items/ID. So this is where we do not know what the value of this ID is in advance. So we can make a URL segment dynamic by prefixing it with a colon. So our route could look something like this: constant routes. So we have our path is to item / and then the dynamic part of our path. We could have multiple dynamic parts of our path. So we could have another / username / whatever else that we want in here. So our path can contain multiple dynamic components that will then open a particular component. So both of these links on these buttons that we see below here, these two router links, would both match the same route because they're both going to item, and then the ID part here would in this one be ABC, and the ID for this one would be DES. We can use the activated route service to be able to grab information from our URL parameters that are passed into the route. The activated route service is part of the Angular router module, and it needs to be imported to our component. So we can see where we import our activated route from our Angular router module. The activated route will give us access to the parameters of the URL. You can get these parameters as either a plain object or as an observable, and we'll look at observables later on. So to create a property of the component, so we need to create a property of the component to store the value that we want to pass in. By injecting the activated route service through the constructor, we then will be able to have access to this .route.snapshot.parammap.get, and we can grab the ID parameter that will get sent in through our route, and we will save that onto or into our ID. Now, I notice there's a mistake here. That should be a lowercase I if it's to match that. We're case sensitive, so that would be wrong. This is all done through the ng-on-init function. So this is something from Angular. It's a function that is run when this component is ready and first run. So this would, when we open up our component, when our component first initializes, it will grab the parameter that was sent through from the route and save that into this ID. We can then use and bind this ID back into the display, the HTML of our component, to show something. We may want to use it to do another query on a database and then show something in our component based on that query. We'll look now at modal data, or how do we create a modal. So a modal is a window or a layer on top of the main application that forces the user to interact with it before sending control back to the main application. On a mobile device screen, real estate's at a premium, so it can be easier to present some bulky input controls in a window of their own. Modals exist outside the standard routing of an Ionic application. The content of a modal is created as a separate page, but we will not have to add it to the app routing module, as modals do not fit with the usual routing structure. When using the Ionic CLI to generate a new page, it will add the route to that page in the app routing module. We can delete that because we won't be doing any routing to that modal page. So modals are managed via a modal controller. So for this example, I'm going to add a link to a modal from our tab 2. You can see our tab 2 of a standard application that's just using the tabs template. The tab 2, or in tab 2, I will have two columns in a single row. In the left column is a label. So here is our label and the value of the username. in the right hand column is the link on the word edit that will open up our modal so that we can then modify our username. So when we click on edit, our modal will open up. We can edit the username, and when we're done, we can click the done button, which will bring us back to our first page. So first we need to generate a new page for our modal content. So a modal is just another page, so we can use a standard Ionic generate page. And in this case, I've called my modal modal. We could call it anything, but in this case, I've just called it modal. So that name's not there because it is a modal. It's just what I've called that particular modal. We need to remove the automatically created route that has been added to the app routing module. As this is a modal, it does not fit in with the existing router structure. We need to import the modal module into our apps module file. So we add this into our apps module because it's not part of the routing structure. We need to have it available basically from the beginning of the app running. It needs to be there rather than being lazily loaded later on. Next, we need to add the modal page module to the imports array of our ng decorator that's in the apps module.ts file. So we're adding the module here and not the page, as it needs to be available now, as it is not part of the standard routing pattern, as I've said before. In the tabs to page.ts file, we will need to import the modal page and the modal controller library packages. So we'll do our import modal page. So this is the page, that component that we created, and this is the modal controller from Angular for managing our modals. To be able to display the username in our tab, we'll create a property of the tabs to page class called username. We will bind this property in the tab view to display the current value of that property. So here we can see this would be the definition of the username that would be within the class of our page 2 component. And then within the HTML file for our page 2 component, we would be using binding to be able to bind this variable into the display of the HTML. Next, we need to add a constructor to our tab to page class, if we didn't already have one there, and inject the modal controller. This will give us access to the modal controller within that particular class. So our constructor for our page 2 class will now be injected with the modal controller. Next, we need to create a new asynchronous or async function that, when called, will create the modal and display it. This is an asynchronous process, so we don't know how long the modal will be open. Once we open, we will wait for the modal to be dismissed before acting on the data it provides. The async await syntax used here is syntactic sugar that replaces the callback syntax. The syntax makes async code look more like procedural code. By defining this as async, it will await the return value before moving on. The component parameter defines the component/page that will be displayed for the modal. Our component props provides the mechanism to pass values into the modal. In this case, I'll pass the current value of the username from the page 2 class, which is this .username. Creating the modal controller does not display the modal, and we'll look at this in a moment. To manage the return value of the modal, we can call on the onDidDismiss method of the modal. This is passed back as a promise, and we will use its .then syntax to get the value. So a promise is another form of an asynchronous call that returns a single value. The return value is sent back as an object with two values, the data and its role. This is why we are getting the value of retval. So here, this is the data that's being returned. and then we will assign the value of the retval data as opposed to the retval role to the username. So this is where passing information back from the modal into our component. To actually display the modal, we need to call modal.present. So at this stage, if we have a look at the async present modal async function, it would look like this. So we have our async present modal. We will await the modal controller. While it creates, we're going to be passing through, or we will want the component that this modal controller opens will be our modal page. We're going to be passing through our username. When it dismisses, we're going to grab the value, the data value of whatever is returned, and save that to our username, and we will present our modal. We then need to modify our page 2 or tab 2 page HTML file to display the username and create a click event on the link that calls the present modal function. So here we would have our click event on the edit link that we had there on the first page, and it will call present modal. That will go to present through the process of opening the modal page and sitting and waiting for the data to come back. We then need to modify our modal page.html file to include an ion input tag for data entry and an ion button to close the modal. So here we would need to have something that is going to allow us to edit in our modal. So this is in our modal page, edit what the value of the username was, and we'll need to have a function here which will close our modal, which will effectively call the onDismiss function to dismiss our modal. In our modal page.ts file, we need to import the modal controller and the navparams modules. These two modules will give us access to the modal controller functions and to get the values passed in from our component props. We can then inject our navparams and modal controller via the constructor. We then need to create a local property of type string called username that's going to hold the value of the username while we're on this page, which is the modal. We're getting close to the end. In our ng-on-init method, we're going to initialize a local property of this.username with a value that's passed in from our component props. So as we load our page, we're going to grab whatever the parameter was and save that into username, where it'll be ready there for us to edit before we say we're done to send whatever this value was changed to back to our original component. We then create a function to close the modal by passing back the value of the username. So here we call our modal controller. So whenever we click on the close modal function, which was a click event on our ion button that's at the bottom of the page, that it will dismiss our modal controller and will pass back the username ready for us to use within our main component. When we've got all that done, we can run our Ionic serve to check that it's all working okay. Let's work through the files that make up this simple modal example. So just having a look over here of our modal example running. So we have a username. If we want to edit that, we can click on edit. That opens our modal. We can put in a particular name. We click on done, and we now have our username has been changed on the front component. So let's go through step by step from sort of the level of the index.html file and work through the files to see what's been added in here to make this happen. So with every Ionic application, it is just, once again, a single HTML page. So everything is driven from our index.html page. So our index.html page is calling this custom app root tag. This custom app root tag is defined by the component whose selector is app root, and the app module defines that the component that is going to be run at boot time, so that's going to be bootstrapped, is the app component. So it's the default component that will get run. and whatever's its template will display at wherever we have app root. In our app module, we've included the module, the modal page module that gets created when we generate our Ionic page component. Each of those components comes with a module. So here we're including this in. We're including it here for the sake that it's not a modal is not part of the standard routing model that's used within Ionic. It sits outside of that. So we need to include that here at the top level so that that modal is available when we want to call it when we're on our tab 2 page. We'll have a look at our HTML for this particular component, and all we're doing is displaying whatever's coming from our router outlet will be displaying in this main component. The tabs are using the router module, but we're not really doing anything with tabbing, so we'll skip over that and we'll have a look at our tab 2 page HTML. So given here we're on page 2 when we're doing this stuff. So if we have a look in here, we can see I've used a simple ion grid, which creates, in this case, a 2-column layout where we've set up a row, and this row contains 2 columns, so 1 and 2. In our first column, we've told it to float to the left so that this column pushes over to our left side of our screen, and we're going to be binding in that the username property of this particular class. And on the right hand side, we're going to have a link, and the click event for that link goes to this present modal function. So let's have a look at the script file for this component. So this component imports the modal controller, and it also imports our modal page. As we went through the description before, our constructor here is bringing in the modal controller, and we've also created in here a property which is going to be storing this username. Our async present modal function is here, so our async await. So this is going to create a modal using this particular page, passing this information. We're also going to say that when it dismisses, that we're going to return a value, and that value will get saved into the local username. Then we actually present the modal, so that actually displays the modal. So creating it doesn't display it, we have to present it once it's been created. So let's go and look into our modal code here. So in our modal page.ts, so our modal, so when we click and go to our modal, it needs to have a memory of what the current username is. So it needs a property of username. We're going to, or up above here, we've injected in the nav params and the modal controller. We need to inject those into our constructor so that we can use those within our class. When this class first initializes, we're going to grab whatever the value of the parameter is that gets passed, which is called username, and save that to our local version of username. When we close the controller by clicking on this done button, we're going to pass back whatever the current version, local version of the username is. Will get passed back, which will generate the on dismiss event, which will then be picked up in our tab page back here, which will then take that data and save it into the tabs version of username. So the HTML of this modal page is simple. We've got a Ion toolbar with a title of modal up the top. We're going to add some content in, and we've added some padding, which gives it a little bit of space off the left and right so that it's not right up against the edge for easier reading. We're going to use an Ion list and a list of Ion list items to be able to enter in the item and the form control. We're using the NG model here to have two-way binding. Remember, this is the banana in a box notation for NG model, which gives us two-way binding. As we change the value here in the form, it's also being changed back here in our class so that this value gets changed. And if we had this being displayed somewhere else in this page, it would also then change. So we get that two-way updating happening. And I've added in below our content, I've added in a footer, and in that footer I have a button, so an Ion button, and I've added a click event to that to tell it to close the modal. And that's about everything we need to have to make a modal work. Just looking here at the modal module, and there's nothing in here that we will have to change. That would have been there by default. Except, we might remember, we've added the forms module on this one here. You probably would have seen that in an example we did in a previous week, where we need to import the forms module to get access to the NG model. If we don't have that forms module imported, the NG model will generate an error for us. Okay.